Lord Norton, and thank you both to the Higher Education Commission and Policy Connect for inviting me to speak at this event today. We'll see if times had been slightly different. We'd probably all be in a room together. I'd be at a lectern addressing everyone. I can see we've got 172 participants so far, which I think is fantastic and testament to, I think, the growing importance that the sector places upon the needs of students with disabilities. And I was particularly delighted to have this opportunity to speak because, as you mentioned, Lord Norton, in the past, my ministerial experience, both as a universities minister, but also as a Cabinet Office minister, when I sought to publish a sort of Every Voice Matters document, looking at how we could enhance the opportunities for individuals with disabilities to be able to participate in our democratic processes. This really is an area of importance to myself, and even as a backbencher, I was secretary of the all-party group on disability, and in the past decade have really made it a mission, a personal mission of myself, to continue the work that all parties have desired in the past decade, to be able to see how we can enhance the needs of disabled students. And I think I just wanted to use my remarks to touch on my experience, rather brief experience, unfortunately, as a minister, when it comes to looking at how to develop policy. I'm not going to touch on the recommendations of the report because I know that Megan Hector will be doing so later. I just wanted to say the report, and I've had a pre-brief with the team, is fantastic. It is a heavy-duty report, and I hope that the recommendations will be looked seriously at government. But from a broader perspective, the recommendations that are broad and do cross a number of actors represent, to me, one of the issues that we have in the policy sphere with dealing with the needs of disabled students. And that is that there are what I call a number of points of contact when it comes to public policy. And often, we focus on these points of contact where individuals will need additional help, not only from the state, but also from institutions, possibly also from regulators. And I think what we've got here is a cross-sectionality where disabled students do need support and help from both their individual universities, both from the Office for Students, both from obviously looking at the financial support that can be provided, and also from the government. And I think it's always vitally important when recognising that platform that needs to be established and created, needs to be woven quite carefully, and needs to be done so in a positive sense, not to criticise universities that maybe have failed in the past for not been able to deliver on the hopes and ambitions of disabled students, but to work with them positively to be able to co-create. And one of the most impressive things for me about this report was actually the number of disabled students with disabilities that the report managed to reach, over 500. And I found it completely transformative when I actually sat down in a room with students to talk about their experiences and their needs, because you will find and pick up viewpoints that you wouldn't have simply thought about sitting in a room in Whitehall with civil servants. And I think that's one of the things that the Commission really needs to be commended upon. I remember holding a round table in Birmingham with visually impaired students, and just being so struck actually by how grinding it must be for those individual students to constantly have to fight and to come up against barriers time and time again. And universities being universities, there are so many different facets to the university experience that obviously no one individual can necessarily think and be able to provide for. But I think that by looking and listening to students, taking that approach that obviously has been taken by the disability community for decades, that still needs to properly seep into the university world, which is that no decision about me without me. And I think that's something that the report needs to be commended for. And I hope that the government will listen to this report, but also look to establish any further recommendations going forward into either legislation or policy by making sure student voice is heard. I think, if anything, the lessons from the current situation with the pandemic is that we know that when it comes to both the campus experience is not the same as an accommodation experience, is not necessarily the same as a student finance experience. And so making sure that those can be joined up effectively is absolutely vital, because ultimately, and I do passionately believe this, that if you get this right, if you get the opportunities and expand the opportunities for students with disabilities, you will actually then have looked at the needs of all students. The entire student experience and student welfare benefits from focusing on the welfare of disabled students in turn. They are mutually reinforcing, because it means that attention is then paid to every part of that transition journey. And when it comes to transition, I welcome the fact that the current university's minister is now beginning to focus on successful participation. And I think that is a narrative that I think we can really work with here, because for too long, and I made this point, I think at Wonky's Life of Student last year when I gave a speech around what I called a STEP framework, a student transition experience progress framework, to try and move away from access and participation, where the emphasis has been on access, to really look at what we mean by participation and to draw that down into different areas. And I think for disabled students, they have the knowledge around what it means for them around their participation. Oddly enough, when it comes to disabled students, looking at the disabled students allowance and the opportunity to apply for that means that straight away they are thrown into the deep end as students when they arrive on campus. They often then have to apply for DSA. And I think from a financial perspective, and obviously there is a great weight to be placed on financial barriers when it comes to disabled students' participation, we do need to look again at the bureaucracy surrounding DSA, and the report makes this clear, and I'm sure Meg will be speaking about this later. I was struck when I turned up as a minister, and I think I've often thought, well, in 20 years' time, in 30 years' time, will this be seen as acceptable? And you take that attitude and try to sort of cast it back into your job. Often, Whitehall and civil service will say, well, this is the way things are, minister, this is the way things are done. But it doesn't, it's your role as a minister to be able to say, no, it's not acceptable in the modern age, this still continues. So one classic example might be looking at that journey, those points of contact between an individual that already has gone through the process of assessment to get an education, health and care plan, and yet has to begin that process all over again when it comes to DSA. And I think we have to ask ourselves, in this world, is that acceptable to treat individuals who already struggled and worked incredibly hard in spite of their individual circumstances to try to raise their aspirations to get to university, to then face that additional barrier? And I don't think it is. And I think that the report casts a number of examples where we have these moments where maybe in 20 years, 30 years time, will we look back and say, we can't believe that used to happen, but it did. And I think it's our responsibility as policymakers, as policy professionals, and as university leaders to look and think, what is acceptable? I think actually when it comes to the disabled experience, one of the words I hate the most is reasonable adjustments. When we actually look at the Disability Discrimination Act that was established in the 1990s and such a vital piece of legislation, when it comes to accessibility, when it comes to accommodation, the word reasonable adjustments is always there. But what might seem reasonable to one person is unreasonable to a disabled person. And I think we have to really look again at what we mean by reasonable and cast that phraseology aside and really get down to understanding that any barrier that is in place for a disabled person to be able to access higher education is unacceptable. Universities, by their very nature, are universal. Campuses, by their very nature, should be inclusive. That benefits not just the disabled person themselves, it benefits all students by having the opportunity to work within an inclusive environment and to benefit from that. I certainly remember when I went to university, it was 20 years ago now, suddenly being opened up to a whole new world that I didn't see at school, a school environment that was quite restrained, quite selective in its nature, and then suddenly going to university and experiencing not only new cultures, new sexualities, but also meeting people for the first time who had needs that were different from myself. And I think that is such an important aspect of the university experience itself. It's why we do need to focus on the disabled student experience. And I would say also that for universities, this can be your USP. I visited 60 universities when I was universities minister within a year, and I saw a number of universities. I wish I'd gone to more. I know Professor Catherine Mitchell's on the call, and I know how important looking at disabled experiences for Derby University. And I apologise that I never managed to get there to see it, but it was Brunel University to see their excellent accommodation facilities, to go up to Teesside to see what they're doing about creating a one-stop shop where they can ensure that DSA the provision of DSA for equipment is provided by the university rather than external providers, which I think is also very important. Or Bath University, which has made a real niche in looking at neurodiversity and ensuring that they take on needs of students with Asperger's or autism. And actually they excel massively in maths courses and physics courses, and they're now getting them placed into city jobs because of their mathematical and computing abilities. So actually you can turn this on its head and say to universities, you want to do this, you can make something and carve a name out for yourself as a result of looking at the needs of disabled students within your community. Because ultimately, in the past 5 years, we've seen the number of students with disabilities rise from about 194,000, sorry, to 272,000, a significant increase. And I'm delighted that we've seen disabled students be able to access master's loans in the past year because we've increased provision for disabled students. But I will end on this, and that is to say this matters. It matters who goes to university. It matters which groups of students from disadvantaged backgrounds go to university. We don't have the data that to be effective to be able to properly target those students yet, and that's always something I think we should also focus on. But this matters for universities, it matters for the students, it matters for the wider student community, and I think this report hopefully will see another step change in where we need to go for the future in the 2020s in order to continue to attract more students from diverse backgrounds into higher education. Thank you very much.